Several countries have demonstrated the ability to shoot down satellites from the ground using missiles. The United States first did this back in 1985, when an Air Force jet launched a missile that struck an old scientific satellite in a test. China grabbed headlines and international condemnation in 2007 by blasting one of its own defunct weather satellites into pieces with a missile, creating a cloud of debris that is still orbiting today. In 2019, India conducted a similar test, destroying a low-orbit satellite to prove it has space weapons. And in November 2021, Russia fired a missile that obliterated one of its unused satellites, generating at least 2,500 pieces of trackable debris in orbit at similar altitude to the International Space Station. That Russian test was widely criticized because the debris threatened other satellites and forced ISS astronauts to shelter. The United States has since declared a moratorium on such destructive tests, urging others to do the same. These ASAT missile tests are usually done under the guise of hitting one's own satellite. No one has yet shot down someone else's satellite in peacetime. But the message is clear. If we can destroy our satellite, we could destroy yours too. The big downside of these attacks is debris. After Russia's 2021 test, US officials blasted the move as reckless for endangering the space environment.
What the Russians did today with these 1,500 pieces of trackable orbital debris poses a risk not only to those astronauts, not only to those cosmonauts, but to satellites, to the interests of all nations.
The most intriguing and complex form of space combat involves one satellite physically approaching and interfering with another. This isn't the Star Wars style dogfighting with laser cannons. It's more like a slow orbital tango. If satellites are like race cars speeding around a track, a co-orbital attack is like one car pulling up next to another and forcing it off the road, but at 28,000 km per hour and in the vacuum of space. Both Russia and China have been testing such capabilities. China launched a satellite called Shijian-21 SJ-21 in late 2021, officially to demonstrate space debris cleanup. In January 2022, SJ-21 did something remarkable. It rendezvoused in geostationary orbit with a derelict Chinese satellite, latched onto it with a robotic arm, and towed it out to a graveyard orbit above GEO. This was a genuine feat of engineering, matching orbits and docking with an object in the vastness of space, and China touted it as a peaceful debris removal test. But military observers noted that the exact same capability could be used offensively. A spacecraft that can grab and move satellites could just as easily shove an enemy satellite into a wrong orbit, or even fling it down toward Earth's atmosphere. US Space Force officials openly stated that China's experiment showed a potential for dogfighting in space, satellites maneuvering unpredictably around others in a sort of orbital cat and mouse. In 2020, a pair of Russian satellites, Cosmos 2542, 2543, trailed a US spy satellite coming uncomfortably close, which prompted the US State Department to complain. Then, one of those Russian satellites released a small projectile in orbit, essentially firing a bullet in space. Russia claimed it was just a small satellite deployment, but the US called it a suspicious ASAT weapons test in orbit. According to a senior US general, in 2019, a Russian satellite had approached a US reconnaissance satellite so closely that operators worried an attack was imminent. These incidents illustrate that orbital maneuvers can be threatening even if no shots are fired. A satellite that sidles up to another could potentially use various methods to disable it, jamming it at point-blank range, spraying it with opaque materials, damaging its sensors, or using a mechanical arm to tamper with it. One ominous concept discussed in Chinese military writings is a small explosive charge or satellite bomb that could be attached to a target's engine nozzle and detonated later. The possibilities for orbital sabotage are endless once you can get close to your target. It's worth noting that the United States likely has its own co-orbital capabilities, though details are secret. The US operates the X-37B, a reusable unmanned spaceplane that looks like a miniature space shuttle. Officially, the X-37B is for testing technologies in orbit, and it has done long-duration flights, over 900 days, carrying various experiments. In one mission, it tested a new system to convert solar energy to microwave power in space, potentially a step towards space-based solar power. But the X-37B's exact activities often remain classified, fueling speculation that it could be a platform for on-orbit espionage or even offensive actions. It could, for instance, deploy small satellites or inspect other objects in orbit. China has noted this and in turn developed its own secretive, reusable spaceplane, which has flown at least twice in 2020 and 2023. Again, details unknown. The mere existence of these craft shows how major powers are investing in more maneuverable, versatile space vehicles that could one day be used in conflicts. A discussion about space weapons often brings up wild ideas like orbital bombardment, the notion of dropping kinetic projectiles from orbit, sometimes nicknamed rods from God, to hit targets on Earth with enormous speed. This concept was examined during the Cold War and periodically resurfaces. Essentially, a satellite would release a tungsten rod or similar, letting gravity accelerate it to impact like a meteor. While very destructive, no country is known to have deployed such a system. It would violate treaties and be technically challenging. However, in recent years, there has been talk in US defense circles about reviving space-based missile defense interceptors. Under the Trump administration, officials and reportedly Elon Musk as a contractor discussed an American Iron Dome in space, a network of interceptors that could shoot down missiles in their launch phase from orbit. This harkens back to Reagan's 1980s Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative, which included a concept called Brilliant Pebbles, hundreds of small hunter-killer satellites to take out ICBMs in flight. With modern tech and lower launch costs, some in Washington believe this could finally be feasible. Of course, if you put missile-killing weapons in space, they could potentially also be used to target satellites, depending on their design. As of now, no country has openly deployed weapons in space, defined as devices intended to destroy targets, as opposed to, say, a surveillance satellite. But the line can blur. If the US or others proceed with orbital missile interceptors in the future, it could mark the first placement of dedicated armaments in orbit. Finally, a chilling category of space weapon is one that we hope remains only hypothetical: nuclear weapons in orbit. Early in the Cold War, both superpowers toyed with the idea of placing nukes in space, either as orbital bombs that could be dropped from above or warheads that could be detonated in space to fry enemy satellites with radiation, EMP. In 1962, both the US and USSR actually detonated nuclear devices at high altitude, the US Starfish Prime test and the Soviet Test 184 a couple months later. The results were dramatic. The EMP from Starfish Prime knocked out streetlights in Hawaii 900 miles away and disabled at least a third of all satellites in low Earth orbit at the time. Basically, a nuclear burst in space could wreak havoc on unshielded satellites over a wide area via radiation and electromagnetic effects, without the immediate blast being felt on the ground. Recognizing how dangerous this was, world powers signed the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which bans the placement of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies. That treaty, joined by over 100 nations, has, so far, kept space free of nukes.
We are taking the first firm step toward keeping outer space free forever from the implements of war.
Even during the tensest years of the Cold War, neither side actually stationed nuclear bombs in orbit full-time. However, recent accusations suggest this taboo may be under strain. In February 2023, US intelligence publicly warned that Russia is developing a new anti-satellite weapon that involves a nuclear device in space. This could mean a specialized warhead intended to be detonated in orbit to destroy satellites via EMP. Exactly what the Outer Space Treaty forbids. The US said such a device, if deployed, would violate the treaty and posed a grave threat to the roughly 9,500 satellites now in orbit, civilian and military alike. Russia denied it has any plan to weaponize space with nukes, but when the issue was brought to the United Nations in April 2024, some revealing diplomacy took place. The US and Japan proposed a simple Security Council resolution to reaffirm the 1967 treaty's ban on nuclear arms in space, essentially asking everyone to recommit to no nukes in orbit. Russia vetoed that resolution to the dismay of other nations. In response, Russia, with some support from China, countered with a broader proposal, a resolution to ban all weapons in space for all time. Not just WMD, but any weapons. This might sound good, but the US and allies saw it as a cynical ploy, since Russia has been developing non-nuclear space weapons for years. The US and others did not support Russia's draft. It failed to pass, and each side accused the other of hypocrisy. American officials essentially said, if Russia truly isn't putting nukes in space, why veto our narrow resolution? What are you hiding? Meanwhile, Russia argued, the US refusal to ban all space weapons shows they want an arms race in space. The back and forth at the UN highlights an unsettling reality. There is currently no broad international agreement preventing the weaponization of space beyond the narrow ban on WMD. Decades ago, the US and USSR decided not to pursue orbital nukes, and that gentleman's agreement held. But today, as more players enter the space arena and conventional military reliance on satellites grows, we're seeing a slow-motion arms race. The US, Russia, and China are each enhancing their ability to attack satellites and protect their own, albeit in different ways. New technologies, from AI-directed satellite swarms to on-orbit servicing robots that double as potential weapons, are emerging. The new arms race and the path ahead space is getting crowded and contested. In many ways, we're in the early stages of a 21st century arms race in orbit, one that involves dazzling lasers, hacking, high-speed interceptors, and even experimental space planes. All the major military powers understand the value of dominating the high ground of space, and none want to be caught lagging. China, for instance, is rapidly ramping up its military space capabilities, launching more satellites, testing advanced anti-satellite systems, and integrating space into its military doctrine. The United States, which has long held the edge in space, is investing heavily to stay ahead, partnering with commercial giants like SpaceX to deploy next-gen satellite networks that can surveil the globe in real time, and quietly developing its own resilient, possibly more secretive space hardware. Russia, with a legacy of space tech but fewer resources today, is nonetheless trying to leverage asymmetric tricks like novel nuclear-powered systems or electronic warfare to remain a threat. The worry is that without some kind of understanding or restraint, a future crisis on Earth could quickly escalate into conflict in space. If, say, a war broke out, each side might attempt to blind the other's satellites through jamming or cyber at first, but perhaps via missiles or co-orbital attacks if the war intensified. The result could be a mess. Crucial satellite services knocked out, debris clouds making orbits hazardous, and even spillover effects on civilian infrastructure. Imagine your GPS navigation or satellite TV failing because of what's happening above. Despite these risks, there is hope for keeping space peaceful, at least to some degree. It lies in diplomacy and recognition of mutual interest. Space, unlike battlefields on Earth, has no borders or populations. It truly is a global commons. A war in space that creates tons of debris would harm everyone, including neutral countries and commercial companies. There's a growing chorus of voices urging new international rules to prevent the most destabilizing actions. For example, after the outcry over the 2021 Russian ASAT test, multiple countries have discussed banning debris causing ASAT tests. The US has self-imposed this ban, and others may follow. There have been proposals for no first use of space weapons pledges, agreements to protect certain satellites, like those that provide worldwide services, or even joint norms for responsible behavior in orbit. As of now, though, concrete agreements are lacking. The major powers continue to prepare for worst-case scenarios. The United States even created a dedicated military branch, the Space Force, to ensure it can fight and win in space if it ever had to. Military exercises increasingly include space components, and generals speak of space superiority much as they do air superiority. We are, for better or worse, entering an era where any serious global conflict will extend to space, because knocking out the enemy's satellites might be the key to victory on the ground. Avoiding catastrophe will require these nations to talk to each other and establish some guardrails. As one US official said, it's in no one's interest to turn space into a shooting gallery. The orbits around Earth are too important to all of us for weather, communications, commerce, science to make it a war zone. Even during the Cold War, adversaries managed to negotiate arms control for nuclear weapons. Perhaps a similar effort can be made for space weapons before it's too late. Coming years will determine whether space remains a realm of relative cooperation and stability, or whether it becomes an active theater of military confrontation. Humanity's dependence on space is only growing, and with it grows the incentive to both protect and, in conflict, to attack that dependence. The hope is that cooler heads will prevail and recognize that a war in space has no real winners. For now, we must face the reality that the high ground of orbit is militarily crucial and thus hotly contested. The next time conflict sparks on Earth, don't be surprised if the opening shots or hacks or jamming signals are fired in the silent darkness of space, hundreds of kilometers above our heads. Ultimately, the goal should be to ensure that space is free from the implements of war, as envisioned decades ago, because weaponizing the heavens benefits no one in the long run. Until global powers come to an understanding, however, the quiet arms race in orbit will continue, and militaries will prepare for battles in this final frontier. Space, once the domain of dreamers and explorers, is now firmly part of the security landscape here on Earth. And as the countless satellites above help guide armies and inform leaders, they also remind us how interconnected and fragile our modern world can be. Balanced on technology, orbiting in the darkness, vulnerable, and in need of wise stewardship rather than reckless conflict.